The dog wasn't supposed to recognize anyone. He'd been trained to forget, trained to heal, trained, in the cold language of the rehabilitation program that built him back up after the war broke him down, to reintegrate without emotional anchoring. But on a gray Tuesday morning in a crowded veterinary lobby in Millhaven, Oregon, a decorated military working dog named Ranger walked past three trainers, his own former handler, and a clipboard-wielding veterinarian, and pressed his scarred head against the knee of an exhausted young nurse nobody in that room had bothered to notice. She hadn't said a word. She hadn't even looked up. And yet the dog trembled like he'd finally come home. If you want to see how far this story travels, hit follow, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now let's get into it. The fluorescent lights in Oak Ridge Veterinary Center buzzed faintly, the kind of low hum that nobody noticed until it stopped. Tuesday mornings were usually slow. A few cats in carriers, a golden retriever puppy throwing up on the linoleum, an elderly woman arguing softly with the receptionist about a billing error. Routine, forgettable. Emma Lawson sat near the far wall with her rescue dog, Biscuit, a scruffy mutt with one ear that never stood upright. She'd worked a 16-hour overnight shift at Millhaven General and hadn't slept since. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair pulled back without much care, and there were faint purple half-moons under her eyes that no amount of coffee had managed to erase. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, an ordinary 31-year-old nurse running errands before collapsing into bed. Nobody in that lobby knew she'd once worn a different uniform. Nobody knew about the things she'd seen, the things she'd done with her hands shoved wrist-deep into wounds that should have killed the men carrying them. That life was folded up and put away, the way you fold a flag you don't want to look at anymore. The door to the back hallway opened, and the noise in the room shifted. A German shepherd walked out on a loose leash, flanked by two veterinary technicians and a broad-shouldered man in his 50s wearing a faded Army field jacket over civilian clothes. Retired Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks moved like a man used to commanding attention without raising his voice. The dog beside him, Ranger, had a thick scar running along his left flank and a slight limp in his back leg, old injuries that had never fully healed. "All right, big guy," Daniel said, voice low and steady. "Let's get you up on the table, nice and easy." Ranger didn't move. His ears went flat. His nose lifted, working the air with sharp, deliberate pulls. The vet tech tugged gently on the leash. Nothing. The dog's paws seemed bolted to the floor. "He's been like this since we pulled into the parking lot," Daniel said, glancing at the lead veterinarian, an older man named Dr. Walter Green, who'd been treating military and police K9S for almost 3 decades. "Wouldn't get out of the truck for 10 minutes. Thought maybe it was the smell of the place. New disinfectant or something." Dr. Green crouched slightly, studying the dog's posture. "His heart rate's elevated, pupils are dilated. This isn't fear, Daniel. Something's got his attention." "There's nothing here to get his attention," Daniel said. "It's a Tuesday morning vet visit." But Ranger wasn't looking at the exam room door. He was looking past Daniel's shoulder, across the lobby, toward the row of plastic chairs against the far wall. "Ranger, heel," Daniel commanded, snapping his fingers. The dog ignored him completely. That alone should have stopped everyone cold. Ranger had a service record that read like a war novel. 4 combat deployments, 4 medals, a near-fatal injury that nearly ended his career before specialists fought to save him. He didn't ignore commands. He'd been trained by some of the best handlers in the country, and discipline was baked so deep into him that even Daniel sometimes joked the dog had better manners than most Marines. And now he was walking, slowly, deliberately, pulling the leash taut, dragging Daniel a half step forward before the older man let the lead go slack rather than fight him. "Ranger!" The dog crossed the lobby floor, weaving between an empty chair and a startled woman holding a cat carrier, his nails clicking against the tile. People pulled their feet back instinctively. A child pointed and asked her mother if the big dog was going to bite someone. Ranger didn't stop until he reached the woman in wrinkled blue scrubs sitting quietly with a scruffy mutt at her feet. He lowered his head and pressed it against her knee. Emma blinked, startled out of her exhausted half-daze. She looked down at the dog. Really looked, taking in the scar, the limp, the unmistakable bearing of an animal that had once been trained for war. and something flickered behind her tired eyes. Just for a second, gone before anyone could name it. "Oh," she said softly, almost to herself. "Hey there." She didn't pet him right away. She held still, the way someone does when they're testing whether a memory is real or imagined. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," Daniel said quickly, jogging over, voice tight with the practiced urgency of a man who'd spent years preventing incidents before they happened. "Stay back, please. He doesn't know you. He doesn't trust strangers, and I don't know what's gotten into him this morning." Emma raised a hand, not in alarm, just acknowledgement. "It's fine." "It's really not," Daniel said. "He's a retired military working dog. He's got a bite history from his service days, even if it's old. I need you to—" Ranger let out a low, almost mournful sound, somewhere between a whine and a sigh, and pushed his head harder into her knee, his tail giving one slow, uncertain wag. Daniel stopped talking. "Across the room, Doctor." Green had gone very still, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene with the kind of focus he usually reserved for reading an X-ray. "Daniel," he said quietly, "look at his tail." "I see it. That's not aggression. That's not even excitement. That's—" Dr. Green paused, searching for the word. "That's relief." Emma finally let her hand rest against the side of Ranger's neck, fingers finding an old patch of scar tissue beneath the fur without even seeming to look for it. Her thumb moved in a slow, practiced circle, the kind of motion you only learn from doing it 100 times before. "It's okay," she murmured, so quietly that only Daniel, standing closest, caught it. I know, buddy." Daniel felt something cold slide down his spine, though he couldn't have explained why. "Ma'am," he said, his voice losing its edge of alarm and gaining something closer to confusion. "Have you met this dog before?" Emma looked up at him. For just a moment, something passed behind her face. Fatigue, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of being asked a question she didn't want to answer. "No," she said. "I don't think so." It was, Daniel would later realize, the first time she lied to him. The lobby didn't return to normal. Not really. People pretended to go back to their magazines and their phones, but the energy in the room had shifted, the way it does when something unexplainable interrupts the boring rhythm of an ordinary day. A young receptionist named Holly leaned across the front desk toward her coworker, whispering loud enough that half the room could hear. "That's so weird. He just walked right over to her like he knew her." "Maybe she smells like another dog," her coworker offered. "Or treats. Some dogs are food obsessed." Holly snorted. "He's not sniffing her purse, Jess. He's basically hugging her leg." Dr. Green crouched down beside Ranger, running his hands along the dog's spine, checking his pulse, watching his eyes. The dog allowed it, but his body stayed angled toward Emma the entire time, as if some invisible thread connected them. "His vitals are settling," Dr. Green said. "Whatever just happened, it calmed him down rather than agitated him." "That doesn't make sense," Daniel said. He turned to Emma. "Ma'am, do you have a dog with him? Did your dog do something to set him off?" Biscuit, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, was busy trying to chew on his own leash. "No," Emma said. "I really don't know what's going on. I just came in for his nail trim." She glanced down, almost apologetically, like she wished she could hand back whatever attention this had drawn toward her. Daniel studied her more closely now. Mid-30s, maybe younger, exhaustion aged people unfairly. Hospital ID badge clipped to her scrub top, the photo slightly faded. Wedding ring? No, not a wedding ring. Some kind of plain silver band on her right hand. Posture too straight for someone slouched in plastic chairs at 7 in the morning. He noticed things like that. Old habit. "You said you came straight from work?" he asked. "Night shift," she said. "I'm a nurse over at Millhaven General." "Long shift?" 16 hours. She managed a small, tired smile. "I should probably be home asleep right now instead of dealing with—" She gestured vaguely at the room, the stairs, the dog still pressed against her leg. "Whatever this is." "I apologize for the disruption," Daniel said, and he meant it, though something in him refused to let the moment go. He's never done this before, not once, not with strangers. Maybe I just have a calming presence, Emma said, the joke landing flat and a little too practiced, like deflection she'd used before. Dr. Green, still crouched beside Ranger, glanced up sharply. Ms. Lawson, is it? He'd caught the name from her badge. That's right. Have you ever worked with military or police K-9 units, search and rescue, anything like that? There it was again. That flicker. Quick, almost imperceptible, the kind of micro-expression you'd miss if you weren't trained to look for it. Daniel had spent 2 decades reading faces in places where a wrong read could get someone killed. He saw it. No, Emma said. Just regular nursing. ER, mostly. Now I float between MedSurg and the ICU. Funny, Dr. Green said, standing slowly, brushing dog hair off his slacks. Because in 28 years of treating working dogs, I've seen this exact reaction maybe twice. Both times it was a handler reunion, a dog finding someone he served alongside after years apart. I've never served, Emma said, and this time her voice carried a little more edge, a little more finality, like a door closing. Of course, Dr. Green said, though his eyes didn't quite agree. Daniel watched the exchange with growing unease. 23 years in the Army had taught him plenty of things, but the most useful skill, the one that had kept him and his soldiers alive more than once, was the ability to recognize when someone was telling a partial truth. Emma Lawson wasn't lying about being a nurse. That part was obviously painfully true. Anyone who'd worked 16-hour shifts could see it written across her face. But something else sat underneath that truth, folded away and guarded. All right, he said finally, deciding not to push further in front of an audience. Let's get him into the exam room. Doc, can you take a look at his back leg while we're here? He's been favoring it more this week. Dr. Green nodded, gesturing for the tech to bring the leash. Ranger didn't budge. Ranger, come, Daniel said again, with the same flat command tone that had worked on this dog for the better part of 3 years. Nothing. The dog sat down, planting himself directly against Emma's leg, and looked up at her with an expression that, if you didn't know better, if you weren't a trained professional standing in a public lobby trying to maintain some shred of order, could only be described as pleading. Emma sighed, glancing at Daniel with something like apology in her eyes. I think he wants me to go with you. That's not really how this works, Daniel said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't entirely sure they were true anymore. They compromised. Emma agreed to walk with them into the exam room just long enough to get Ranger settled, and then she could leave. Biscuit trotted along beside her, blissfully unaware that he'd been temporarily forgotten in the drama of the morning. The exam room was small, sterile, smelling of antiseptic and nervous animal sweat. Ranger climbed onto the table without protest the moment Emma stood beside it, something he hadn't done in the lobby for his own handler. Unbelievable, muttered one of the vet techs. Dr. Green examined the dog's back leg, fingers pressing gently along the joint, while Ranger held perfectly still, eyes never leaving Emma's face. Old injury, Dr. Green said. Some scar tissues tightened up. Nothing alarming, but I want to start him on a different anti-inflammatory and some light hydrotherapy if you can manage it. We can manage it, Daniel said, though his attention wasn't really on the medical details anymore. He was watching Emma's hand resting on Ranger's neck, watching the dog's breathing slow and even out beneath her touch, watching something in her own shoulders loosen slightly, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. Sure. Where'd you grow up? Ohio originally. Why? Just curious. He paused. How long have you been a nurse? Going on 6 years at Millhaven General. Before that I did some travel nursing. She said it smoothly, easily, the practiced cadence of someone who'd answered the question 100 times before. But Daniel noticed the gap. 6 years at Millhaven, some travel nursing before that, but nothing about where exactly that travel nursing had taken her. A 6-year-old hole in a story that otherwise sounded rehearsed. Travel nursing where? Emma's hand paused on Ranger's neck for half a second before resuming its slow circle. All over, you know how it is, wherever the contracts took me. Sure, Daniel said, though he didn't sound convinced. Dr. Green, finishing up his notes on a clipboard, glanced between the two of them with the expression of a man who sensed a conversation happening beneath the conversation and wasn't quite sure he wanted to get involved. "Ms. Lawson," he said instead, choosing the safer subject, "I'd like to schedule a follow-up in 3 weeks to check his progress. If it wouldn't be too strange to ask, and feel free to say no, would you be willing to come back for that appointment? I think his stress levels respond better when you're present." Emma hesitated. The request hung in the air, heavier than it should have been for something so simple. "I work a lot of overnights," she said. "It might be hard to make appointments during the week." "We can work around your schedule," Daniel offered quickly, surprising even himself with how fast the words came out. Emma looked at him, and for a moment the exhaustion in her face gave way to something sharper, something that assessed him the way you'd size up an opponent across a room. It lasted only a second. Then it was gone, replaced by the same polite, tired smile she'd worn since she first sat down in that waiting room. "I'll think about it," she said. She gave Ranger one last scratch behind the ears, gathered up Biscuit's leash, and offered a small nod toward Dr. Green. "Good luck with the hydrotherapy. He'll probably hate the water at first. They always do." "You sound like you know dogs pretty well," Dr. Green said. "I grew up with them," Emma said simply, and walked out of the exam room before anyone could ask anything else. She made it as far as the parking lot before her hands started shaking. Emma leaned against her car, a battered sedan with 200,000 miles on it, and pressed the heel of her palm against her sternum, breathing slowly through her nose the way she'd taught a dozen anxious patients to do during panic attacks, never once admitting to anyone that she used the same trick herself. Biscuit whined at her feet, sensing something wrong, and she crouched down to scratch behind his ears, grounding herself in the simple, uncomplicated warmth of her own dog. "It's fine," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It's nothing. Coincidence." Except it wasn't nothing, and some buried, disciplined part of her brain, the part that had once calculated triage priorities under mortar fire, the part that had learned to read vital signs faster than most people could read a clock, knew exactly what she'd just witnessed. Ranger. The scar on his flank, the slight limp, the particular way he carried his weight on his back left leg to favor an old wound that had once nearly killed him. She'd spent 4 months of her life with that dog, 4 months in a forward operating base in a country she'd promised herself she'd never speak the name of again. 4 months teaching a broken, traumatized animal that hands could heal instead of hurt. She'd named him Ranger herself, actually, back when he'd come in as an unnamed casualty with no tags, no records, nothing but a service number and catastrophic injuries that should have ended his career, maybe his life. And now he'd found her in a vet clinic in Millhaven, Oregon, 4 years and one careful, deliberate identity later. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her hospital supervisor asking if she could pick up an extra shift this weekend. Ordinary, mundane, the kind of message that belonged to the life she'd built. Emma Lawson, civilian nurse, no past, no complications, no questions anyone needed to ask. She typed back a quick yes and slid into the driver's seat, hands finally steady enough to grip the wheel. She told herself it was over. A strange coincidence, an emotional dog, nothing more. She'd go home, sleep for 6 hours, and come back to her ordinary life by evening shift. She did not know, as she pulled out of the parking lot, that Daniel Brooks was standing at the clinic's front window, watching her car disappear down the street, already pulling out his phone to make a call he hadn't made in almost 4 years. To an old contact still working in military personnel records, the kind of contact who could pull a name and run it quietly against deployment rosters without anyone else needing to know why. And she did not know that somewhere in a digitized military archive, behind several layers of clearance most people never saw, her real name, not Emma Lawson, but the name she'd been born with and buried the day she signed her discharge paperwork, was about to surface for the first time in years. The photograph was still in her bag. The one she'd forgotten was there. The one that would slip free the next time she reached for her keys, landing face up on a clinic floor for anyone to see. She had no idea the ground beneath her careful, quiet life had already started to crack. The photograph was still in her bag. Daniel didn't know that yet. He stood at the clinic's front window with his phone against his ear, listening to it ring on the other end, watching the spot where her sedan had been until the exhaust fumes finally cleared from the cold morning air. "Brooks, it's been a while." The voice on the line belonged to Patricia Vance, a records administrator he'd worked alongside during his last 3 years of active service, back when she'd been the only person in personnel who actually answered her phone before 5 rings. She'd retired the same year he had, settled into a quieter civilian job processing veteran benefits. But she still had contacts, still had the kind of institutional memory that didn't show up in any database. "Pat, I need a favor. Off the books, if you can manage it." That's how you usually ask. "I've got a name, civilian name, current. I need to know if it matches anyone who served, specifically anyone attached to K-9 rehabilitation around 6-7 years back." There was a pause, the particular silence of someone weighing how much trouble a request was worth. "You know I can't just go pulling personnel files because a dog got excited at the vet." "It wasn't excited, Pat. It was something else." He kept his voice low, aware of Dr. Green moving around behind the front desk, pretending not to listen while clearly listening. "Ranger ignored every command I gave him. He hasn't done that since the day we brought him home." He walked across a packed lobby and put his head in this woman's lap like she was the only person in the building. "Dogs do strange things. Not Ranger, not this dog. Not like that." Another pause, longer this time. Patricia had handled enough working dog files during her career to know that bonding like that wasn't random. "Give me the name." "Emma Lawson. Civilian nurse, works out of Millhaven General, says she's never served, says she's never worked with K-9 units." He hesitated. "She's lying about something, Pat. I don't know what yet." "I'll see what I can find. No promises. And Daniel, if there's nothing there, you let it go. You're not active duty anymore. This isn't your investigation to run." "Understood," he said, though even as the word left his mouth, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Emma slept for exactly 4 hours before her phone alarm dragged her back into consciousness. She lay still for a moment, staring at the water stain on her bedroom ceiling that she kept meaning to ask her landlord about, and tried to convince herself that the morning's events had already faded into something forgettable. They hadn't. She could still feel the particular weight of Ranger's head against her knee, the specific texture of that old scar beneath her fingers. Bodies remembered things minds tried to bury. She knew that better than almost anyone. She'd spent years treating men and women whose hands shook at sounds nobody else in the room even noticed, whose bodies flinched from touches that should have felt safe. She understood trauma as a clinical fact, a pattern of symptoms, a set of interventions. She understood it less well as something living inside her own chest. Biscuit nosed open her bedroom door and hopped onto the bed, settling against her side with the easy confidence of an animal who had never once doubted he belonged there. She scratched behind his ears and tried not to think about Daniel Brooks watching her too closely, asking questions that sounded casual but weren't. She showered, dressed in fresh scrubs, and drove to Millhaven General with 20 minutes to spare before her shift, enough time to grab coffee from the break room and pretend, for a little while longer, that her life was exactly as small and uncomplicated as she'd built it to be. It didn't last. Lawson. Her charge nurse, a sharp-eyed woman named Renata Cole who ran the med-surg floor with the efficiency of someone who'd survived 20 years of hospital politics, caught her at the nurse's station before she'd even clocked in. "You've got a meeting with administration at the end of your shift. Mandatory." "About what?" "They didn't say, just said be there." Renata's expression flickered with something that looked almost like sympathy, which from her was practically an alarm bell. "You're not in trouble, are you?" "Not that I know of." "Good. Because Whitfield's been weird about staffing budgets lately, and weird usually means somebody's about to get cut." Renata handed her a tablet with the morning's patient assignments. "Anyway, Bed 4 needs his dressing changed, and Bed 7's been asking for you specifically. Something about how you're the only one who doesn't talk to him like he's an idiot." Emma managed a tired smile and got to work, grateful, for a few hours at least, to disappear into the rhythm of the job she actually loved, checking vitals, adjusting medications, sitting with frightened patients, and walking them through procedures in plain language, instead of the clinical jargon that made hospitals feel like foreign countries. This was the version of herself she'd chosen. Steady, useful, anonymous. The meeting with administration came at the end of a 12-hour shift, and it took less than 10 minutes to upend everything. Gregory Whitfield, the hospital's director of nursing operations, sat behind a desk too large for the size of his office, Flanked by a human resources representative Emma had spoken to exactly twice before, both times during onboarding. Neither of them offered her a seat right away, which told her something before a single word was spoken. "Ms. Lawson," Whitfield said, not quite meeting her eyes. "We've had some concerns raised about discrepancies in your employment history." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Your application listed 6 years of continuous nursing experience, including a period of travel nursing prior to your employment here. We ran a routine verification, standard procedure, nothing personal, and we weren't able to confirm employment at 2 of the facilities you listed." Emma kept her face carefully neutral, the same expression she used when delivering bad news to families in the ICU waiting room. "There might have been a paperwork error. Some of those contracts were short-term, through staffing agencies that may have since closed." "That's what we initially assumed," Whitfield said, "but then we received an inquiry today from the Department of Defense." The room went very quiet. Emma felt something cold settle into her stomach, but she kept her hands still in her lap, kept her breathing even. "What kind of inquiry?" "A records request related to a service history that doesn't appear anywhere in your personnel file." Whitfield finally looked at her directly. "Ms. Lawson, did you serve in the military?" There it was. The question she'd avoided for 4 years, sitting on the table between them like a loaded weapon nobody wanted to be the first to pick up. "That's not relevant to my qualifications as a nurse," she said carefully. "It's relevant if you lied on your application," the HR representative said, speaking for the first time, her tone clipped and procedural. "Omission of military service isn't typically a disqualifying factor, Ms. Lawson. In fact, most hospitals view it favorably, so we're having trouble understanding why you'd hide it rather than disclose it." "I didn't hide anything maliciously," Emma said. "I left a part of my history private. That's different from lying." "It's a distinction we're not sure the hospital's board will appreciate," Whitfield said. "Given the sensitivity around staff credentials and the recent inquiry, we're placing you on administrative leave effective immediately, pending a full review. You're suspending me. It's a leave of absence, paid, for now." Whitfield slid a folder across the desk, the kind of gesture meant to look procedural and considerate when it was neither. "We need you to cooperate fully with the review. That includes providing documentation of your complete service history." Emma stared at the folder without touching it. 4 years of careful, deliberate ordinariness, unraveling because a dog had recognized her in a vet clinic waiting room. "This is happening because of what occurred at the veterinary office yesterday," she said. It wasn't a question. Whitfield had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "We received the DOD inquiry this morning. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about timing." "You're punishing me for something that hasn't even been confirmed yet." "We're following protocol," Whitfield said, and the careful blankness of his tone told her there was no point arguing further. Protocol was a word people used when they wanted to avoid responsibility for a decision. She left the office with the folder under her arm and her hospital ID still clipped uselessly to her scrub top, walking past nurses she'd worked alongside for years, none of whom yet knew that she'd just been quietly erased from the floor she'd spent 6 years earning a place on. Word traveled fast in the hospital. By the time Emma reached the parking garage, her phone had already buzzed twice with messages from coworkers who'd somehow heard before she'd even left the building. "Heard you got pulled off the schedule. Everything okay? Whitfield's been weird all week. Don't let him push you around." She didn't answer either message. She sat in her car in the dim concrete garage and let herself feel, just for a moment, the particular humiliation of being treated like a liability instead of a person, of having years of competent, careful work reduced to a paperwork discrepancy that administrators got to weaponize whenever it suited them. She thought about calling someone. There wasn't really anyone to call. The people who'd known her old life were scattered, most of them still serving, a few discharged and disappeared into civilian lives of their own, none of them people she'd kept in contact with on purpose. That had been the plan. Clean break. New name, sort of, not legally changed, just quietly emphasized. Emma instead of the name they'd called her overseas. Lawson instead of the surname that occasionally got recognized by the wrong person at the wrong time. It had worked for 4 years. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Local area code. She almost let it go to voicemail before some old instinct, the kind that never let a ringing phone pass unanswered during deployment, made her pick up. This is Emma. Ms. Lawson, it's Daniel Brooks, from the veterinary clinic. She closed her eyes briefly. Mr. Brooks, I wanted to apologize for any trouble this might have caused you. I made a call to an old contact just trying to understand what happened with Ranger. I didn't expect it to move that fast. It moved fast enough to get me suspended from my job about 4 hours ago. The silence on his end carried genuine surprise. I didn't intend for that to happen. Intentions don't really matter once the paperwork starts moving, Mr. Brooks. She kept her voice flat, controlled, the same tone she used when delivering difficult diagnoses. You opened a door I'd spent years keeping shut. I hope whatever you found was worth it. I haven't heard back yet. I just made an inquiry. Well, your inquiry's already done its damage. She paused, debating whether to ask the question pressing against the back of her throat. What exactly did you ask your contact to look for? Whether your name matched anyone who served in canine rehabilitation roughly 6 or 7 years back. Emma's hand tightened on the steering wheel. 6 or 7 years back was wrong by a year, but close enough that it wouldn't take much more digging to land on the exact deployment, the exact base, the exact dog she'd spent 4 months rebuilding from a creature too traumatized to let anyone near him. You should have left it alone, she said quietly. Ms. Lawson, if you served, that's not something to hide. That's something people respect. You don't understand what I hid or why, she said, and I'd appreciate you not digging any further. She ended the call before he could respond and sat in the dim garage with her hands shaking again, the same way they had the morning before, except this time the shaking didn't settle as easily. Daniel stood in his kitchen that evening, phone in hand, staring at a name on the screen that Patricia had sent him an hour earlier. He hadn't expected an answer this quickly. He certainly hadn't expected the answer to come with a flag attached, a notation indicating that further details required clearance he no longer held. Found a partial match. Records are sealed above my access level. That's unusual for a standard service file, Daniel. Whatever she did, it wasn't ordinary nursing duty. I'd be careful pushing further without knowing why those records are locked down. He read the message twice, feeling the particular unease that came from realizing a simple curiosity had brushed up against something larger than he'd anticipated. Sealed records weren't unusual for classified operations. Intelligence work, certain special operations medical units that operated outside conventional channels. They weren't typical for someone who claimed to have never served at all. Ranger lay across the kitchen tile, watching him with the patient, knowing stillness of a dog who understood his handler's moods better than most humans did. What did she do, buddy? Daniel asked quietly, crouching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Why is everybody so interested in keeping it quiet? Ranger huffed, resting his chin on his paws, eyes drifting half-closed. Daniel's phone buzzed again. A text this time from Dr. Green. Got a call from someone identifying as hospital administration at Millhaven General, asking about Ranger's veterinary records and whether we had documentation tying him to a specific handler or rehabilitation history. Seemed unusual. Wanted to give you a heads up. Daniel frowned at the message. Hospital administration calling a veterinary clinic about a dog's records didn't make sense unless someone was building a case, trying to connect dots between Emma's hospital employment and her supposed military past. Which meant someone at Millhaven General had moved fast, faster than a routine personnel review should have moved, and that kind of speed usually meant someone higher up had taken a personal interest. He thought about Emma's voice on the phone, the controlled anger beneath the exhaustion, the unmistakable sense that he'd triggered something far bigger than a curious phone call to an old Army contact. He'd spent 23 years learning to recognize when he'd made a mistake. This felt like one, even if he couldn't yet see the full shape of what he'd broken. The administrative review meeting happened 3 days later in a conference room on the hospital's top floor that Emma had never had reason to visit before. She sat across a long table from Whitfield, the HR representative, and a man she didn't recognize, introduced only as a representative from the hospital's legal counsel. Ms. Lawson, Whitfield began, we've completed our preliminary review. I want to be direct with you. The Department of Defense inquiry referenced a sealed personnel file. We were unable to obtain confirmation of your specific service record, role, or discharge status. That's because it's sealed, Emma said. Some service records are classified for operational reasons. That's a difficult position for the hospital, the legal representative said, speaking for the first time, his tone smooth and practiced in the particular way of someone who billed by the hour. We have no way to verify your credentials, your character, or your eligibility for continued employment if your background remains opaque. My nursing credentials are fully verified, Emma said, struggling to keep her voice level. My license is current. My clinical record at this hospital is spotless. None of that has anything to do with whatever happened before I came here. Except it does, Whitfield said, because the inquiry has raised questions about whether you misrepresented your background, which is itself grounds for termination under our employee conduct policy. I omitted information. I never lied. The distinction matters less to the hospital's board than you might hope, the legal representative said. Emma felt the floor of her carefully built life tilting further beneath her, each word from across the table, another crack spreading through years of deliberate ordinariness. She thought about all the patients she'd cared for, all the overnight shifts she'd covered without complaint, all the competence she'd poured into a job she genuinely loved, reduced, in this sterile conference room, to a liability assessment. "What exactly are you deciding here?" she asked. Whitfield exchanged a glance with the legal representative before answering. "Pending further clarification from the Department of Defense regarding your status, we're extending your administrative leave. Unpaid, effective immediately." The words landed like a slap. "You're cutting off my income while you wait for an answer you might never get, because some of my service history is classified." "We understand this is difficult," the HR representative said, in the flat, rehearsed tone of someone who clearly didn't understand anything at all. "Do you?" Emma stood, pushing her chair back harder than she meant to. "I have given this hospital 6 years of work. I have never once called out sick without cause. I have covered shifts nobody else wanted, trained new nurses who are now running floors better than I could, and the one time something from my past surfaces, you don't ask if I need support. You cut my pay and treat me like a security risk." "Ms. Lawson, I'm done," she said, gathering her bag, hands trembling with an anger she rarely let herself feel in front of other people. "Let me know when your review concludes. Or don't. I'm not sure it matters anymore." She walked out of the conference room with her head high, the way she'd been trained to walk out of far worse rooms than this one, and made it all the way to the parking garage before the weight of it caught up with her, and she had to sit in her car for 10 minutes, just breathing, just holding herself together one ragged breath at a time. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unfamiliar number. "This is Renata. Heard what happened." For what it's worth, half the floor doesn't believe a word of the misconduct story. You're one of the best nurses I've worked with in 20 years. Don't let them make you feel small. Emma stared at the message, throat tight, and didn't trust herself to respond right away. The photograph fell out of her bag 4 days later, in the produce aisle of a grocery store 3 miles from her apartment, landing face up on the linoleum floor for a stranger to pick up and hand back to her with a polite, unknowing smile. "You dropped this." Emma took the photo with a murmured thanks, glancing down at it before sliding it back into the inner pocket of her bag, where it had apparently worked loose over the past several days, slipping past a torn lining seam she'd meant to fix months ago. It was an old photograph, slightly creased, colors faded from years of handling. A much younger version of herself, hair shorter, posture straighter, standing in desert tan fatigues beside a German shepherd with a thick bandage wrapped around his hindquarters. Her arm rested over the dog's back. She wasn't smiling in the photograph. Nobody smiled much in that particular season of her life, but there was something steady in her eyes, something that had nothing to do with the careful blankness she'd practiced wearing ever since. She hadn't looked at this photograph in years. She'd forgotten she still carried it. She should have destroyed it long ago. Some stubborn, sentimental part of her had never been able to make herself do it. That night, unable to sleep, she sat at her kitchen table with the photograph propped against a coffee mug, staring at the image of a dog who'd once trusted her enough to let her hands near wounds that would have made most handlers reach for a muzzle instead. She thought about the 4 months she'd spent at that forward base, The particular silence of a recovery ward at 3 in the morning, the slow, painstaking work of teaching a traumatized animal that not every hand reaching toward him intended harm. She thought about the day she'd left, the dog watching her board a transport vehicle with an expression she'd spent years trying not to remember. Her phone buzzed. Daniel, again. I know you asked me to leave it alone. I think you should know that someone connected to your hospital reached out to my clinic asking about Ranger's records. I didn't give them anything, but I think there's more going on here than a misplaced employment file. If you want to talk, I'm willing to listen. No agenda. She read the message 3 times before setting the phone down without responding. Outside, a car alarm wailed somewhere down the street, sharp and insistent, and Biscuit lifted his head from where he'd been sleeping against her feet, ears swiveling toward the sound before settling again when it finally stopped. Emma picked the photograph back up, running her thumb along its worn edge. She thought about disappearing again. Changing cities, changing names a little further, starting over somewhere nobody would ever connect a tired nurse to a classified service record. She'd done it once already. She could do it again. But some part of her, the part that had knelt beside a broken, frightened dog every morning for 4 months and refused to give up on him no matter how many times he'd snapped at her hands, felt something close to shame at the idea of running now, of letting a hospital administrator and a paperwork technicality erase 6 years of honest work without a fight. Her phone rang. This time, the screen showed a number she recognized immediately, though she hadn't seen it in over 3 years. A number tied to a name from a life she'd buried, a contact she'd promised herself she'd never need to use again. She stared at it for a long moment before answering. This is Lawson, she said, falling automatically into the old, clipped cadence she hadn't used since her discharge. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, even after all this time, precise, measured, carrying the particular weight of someone who didn't make calls without reason. Sergeant, the voice said, we have a problem. Emma's stomach dropped. What kind of problem? The kind that doesn't stay buried forever. Your file's been flagged. Someone with the right clearance is asking questions about the Hargrove incident, and I think you know exactly why that's a problem for both of us. The room seemed to tilt around her. The Hargrove incident was a name she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years, a name tied to things she'd done in service of saving lives that the official record had quietly, deliberately rewritten to protect people far above her old pay grade. That file was sealed, she said, voice tight, permanently. Sealed isn't the same as forgotten, the voice said. And right now, Sergeant, you're not the only one who should be worried about what happens if it surfaces. The line went dead before she could ask another question, leaving her alone in her kitchen with a faded photograph, a sleeping dog, and the sudden, dawning understanding that whatever Daniel Brooks had stumbled into when his dog crossed that crowded lobby, it was far larger and far more dangerous than a quiet nurse's hidden military past. The line stayed dead in her hand for a long moment before Emma set the phone down on the kitchen table next to the photograph and made herself breathe the way she'd taught 100 panicking patients to breathe. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 6. It didn't work as well when you were the one drowning. The Hargrove incident. She hadn't said that name out loud in almost 4 years. Hadn't let herself think it in detail. Had built an entire second life specifically so she wouldn't have to. And now it was sitting in her kitchen like a body that had been buried wrong and worked its way back to the surface. Biscuit lifted his head again, sensing something in her stillness that worried him more than the car alarm had. She reached down and scratched his ears, more for her own steadiness than his. It's fine, she told him, the same lies she'd told herself twice now in 4 days. She picked up her phone and stared at Daniel's last message, the offer to listen, no agenda. She'd dismissed it an hour ago. Now she wasn't so sure she could afford to. She typed back before she could talk herself out of it. Where are you right now? The reply came fast. Home. You want to talk? Not on the phone. Can you meet me somewhere in 20 minutes? Name the place. She gave him a diner 2 miles from her apartment, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a waitress who'd worked there longer than Emma had been alive. A place with 2 exits and clear sightlines to the parking lot, because some habits never fully left you, no matter how many years you spent pretending otherwise. She left the photograph on the table. She didn't bring it. Some things you kept close to the chest until you were certain who deserved to see them. Daniel was already in a booth near the back when she arrived, 2 cups of coffee on the table. Ranger curled at his feet despite the diner's obvious no pets policy, which the waitress had apparently decided not to enforce against a man who clearly used to be somebody's sergeant. Emma slid into the booth across from him. Ranger's ears perked at her arrival, his tail thumping once against the floor, but he stayed where he was, watching her with the patient attentiveness of an animal who'd already decided she was someone worth watching. "You look like you haven't slept," Daniel said. "I haven't." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup without drinking from it. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "All right. When you called your contact about me, did you give her a name or just a description?" "I gave her your name, Emma Lawson." He studied her face. "Why does that matter?" "Because someone called me tonight. Someone I haven't spoken to in 3 years. Someone who shouldn't have known I existed in this city under this name, unless my file got flagged in a system that very specific people monitor." She kept her voice low, controlled, the clinical flatness she used when telling families their loved one wasn't going to make it. "Your inquiry didn't just open a door, Mr. Brooks. It rang a bell that people I used to work for have been listening for years." Daniel set his coffee down slowly. "What kind of people?" "The kind that don't appear on org charts." She glanced toward the diner's front window, an old reflex checking the parking lot for anything that didn't belong. "I need you to tell me exactly what you asked for and exactly what she found, word for word." "She told me there was a partial match, records sealed above her clearance level. She warned me not to push further without knowing why." Daniel leaned forward. "Emma, what did you do?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, turning the coffee cup slowly between her hands, watching the dark liquid ripple. 6 years ago, I was attached to a forward surgical team near a base I'm not going to name," she said finally. "Officially, my job was combat nursing, trauma stabilization, triage, transport coordination. Unofficially, for about 4 months, I was assigned to something else, a program that used medical personnel with specific clearance to support operations that required a cover most people wouldn't question. A nurse. Nobody looks twice at a nurse." "What kind of operations?" "I treated people who weren't supposed to exist on any manifest. Detainees sometimes, assets other times. People moved through facilities that didn't have official names." Her voice stayed level, but her knuckles had gone white around the coffee cup. "There was an incident. A man under our care died during an interrogation that should never have happened the way it did. The official report blamed equipment failure. I was there. I know what actually happened." "You testified?" "I refused to sign the report as written. I wrote my own account and submitted it through channels that were supposed to protect whistleblowers." She laughed, short and bitter. "They sealed my file instead, buried the report, discharged me quietly with a recommendation that I never discuss any of it, dressed up as a security clearance condition. I took the deal because the alternative was a court-martial on fabricated grounds, and I had about as much leverage as a private with no lawyer and no friends in high places. And the dog. Ranger came to me about a month before all of that happened. He'd been injured pulling a handler out of a collapsed structure during an operation that went bad. Internal program, not regular K-9 course. Most of the people who knew his real service history are either still serving somewhere they can't talk about it, or they're the same people who'd prefer the Hargrove incident stays buried. She finally looked up at him. Which means the moment your contact pulled my name against a K-9 rehabilitation search, she didn't just find a sealed personnel file. She tripped a flag connected to an active suppression order. And those don't just sit quietly. Someone gets notified. Tonight, apparently, that someone called me. Daniel sat back, processing. 23 years of service had taught him plenty about the gap between official records and battlefield truth. But this was a different animal entirely, deliberate, institutional, the kind of cover-up that required resources and motive far beyond a single bad actor. What did they say? On the phone, that my file's been flagged, that someone with proper clearance is asking questions about Hargrove, and that I'm not the only one who should be worried. She met his eyes. Mr. Brooks, I think that's a threat, and I think it's directed at both of us now, Shaush. The diner's overhead lights flickered briefly, the kind of electrical hiccup that meant nothing most nights and felt like an omen on this one. The waitress refilled their coffee without being asked and moved away again, oblivious to the conversation reshaping itself at her table 6. "I need you to understand something," Daniel said. "I spent 23 years following orders I sometimes didn't agree with because the chain of command existed for a reason. But I also spent 23 years watching good people get buried under bad paperwork because somebody higher up needed a clean story more than they needed the truth." He reached down, scratching behind Ranger's ears without looking, an old, unconscious habit. "If what you're telling me is real, you're not the villain in this story. You're the only person who refused to lie." That's a nice sentiment. It doesn't change the fact that the people who buried this the first time clearly still have the reach to flag a database the moment my name surfaces. Emma rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion of the last week pulling at her face. "And it doesn't change the fact that my hospital just suspended me without pay because they got a Department of Defense inquiry they don't understand and can't get answered. I can help with that part at least. I still know people. Retired people. Retired people who are friends with people who aren't retired." He held up a hand before she could argue. "I'm not asking permission, Emma. I already pulled one thread I shouldn't have pulled. I'm not going to pretend I didn't, and I'm not going to pretend I can just walk away now that I know what's actually unraveling." Emma studied him for a long moment, weighing something behind her tired eyes. "Why does this matter to you? You don't know me. You barely know Ranger's full history. This isn't your fight." "He's been favoring that back leg for 3 years, Daniel said quietly. "Every specialist I've taken him to says it's old scar tissue. Nothing to be done. The day he walked across that lobby and put his head on your knee, it was the first time in 3 years I've seen him stand without shifting his weight off it. Like whatever pain he's been carrying eased the second he found you." He held her gaze. "I don't fully understand what that means, but I know it means something, and I'm not in the business of ignoring things that mean something just because it's inconvenient." Outside, a car pulled into the lot and idled near the entrance for a beat too long before backing out and driving away. Emma's eyes tracked it the entire time, and Daniel noticed. "You think someone's watching you?" "I think someone made a phone call tonight specifically designed to remind me how exposed I am," she said. "Whether that means active surveillance or just a warning shot, I can't say yet. But I've survived long enough by assuming the worst-case scenario is the accurate one until proven otherwise." "Then let's assume the worst case," Daniel said. "What does the worst case look like?" "The worst case looks like someone deciding it's cleaner to discredit me publicly, paint me as an unstable former soldier with a fabricated grievance, than to risk the Hargrove report surfacing through legitimate channels." She said it without flinching, the same flat clinical delivery she'd probably used to tell 100 families their loved one had 3 months left to live. "It looks like my hospital firing me for cause based on falsified documentation they'll claim came from an internal whistleblower. It looks like my credibility getting destroyed before anyone ever asks what actually happened to the man who died in that facility. And the dog. The dog's just collateral damage in their eyes. An emotional complication nobody anticipated." Something in her voice cracked slightly there, the first real fracture Daniel had heard since she sat down. "I spent 4 months teaching that animal that he was allowed to trust again. I'm not going to let him become a footnote in somebody's cover-up." They left the diner a little after midnight, and Daniel insisted on following her home, citing nothing more specific than a feeling he didn't entirely trust himself to explain. Emma didn't argue. 4 years of careful solitude had worn thin in the space of a single conversation, and some buried part of her, the part that used to operate inside a chain of command, was grateful to have someone watching her back again. 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. Emma's hospital review remained open, unresolved, her paycheck frozen while administrators waited for clarification that wasn't coming through any official channel. She filled the hours with restless energy, cleaning her apartment twice, walking Biscuit longer than he probably wanted, calling a lawyer recommended by Renata who specialized in employment disputes, and listened to her carefully edited version of events with growing concern. "Ms. Lawson, if there's an active Department of Defense inquiry tied to a sealed personnel file, your hospital may genuinely be navigating a legal gray area," the lawyer said over the phone. "But unpaid administrative leave without a clear timeline or stated cause borders on constructive termination. I'd need documentation to build a case." I don't have documentation. That's the entire problem. The relevant records are sealed. Then we may need to force the issue. Sometimes the fastest way to get sealed records moving is to make enough institutional noise that someone decides unsealing them is less trouble than the alternative. Emma thanked her and hung up, uncertain whether making noise would protect her or simply paint a larger target on her back. The call came on the third night. While she was finishing a late dinner she'd barely touched, Biscuit curled against her feet. Daniel's name on the screen, his voice tight with an urgency she hadn't heard from him before. Emma, turn on the local news, Channel 9. She grabbed the remote, hands already cold with anticipation, and switched to a segment already in progress, a polished anchor reading from a teleprompter with the particular gravity reserved for breaking local stories. Sources within Millhaven General Hospital allege that a nurse currently under internal review falsified portions of her employment application, including claims related to prior healthcare experience that investigators have been unable to verify. The hospital has declined to comment on personnel matters, but a leaked internal memo obtained by Channel 9 suggests the nurse in question may have misrepresented credentials connected to specialized trauma care, raising questions about patient safety during her tenure. Emma stared at the screen, her own photo, an old hospital ID badge image she hadn't seen used anywhere else, displayed in the corner of the frame beside the anchor's face. "They're going public," she said, voice flat with disbelief. "They're going public before the review's even finished." "Emma, this isn't your hospital leaking this," Daniel said, his voice grim. "Hospitals don't leak unverified internal memos to local news to protect themselves from liability. This is somebody making sure your name gets dragged through the mud before anyone takes your version of events seriously." "They're discrediting me," she said, the worst-case scenario she'd described 2 nights ago arriving exactly on schedule, faster and uglier than she'd allowed herself to imagine. "Exactly the way I told you they would. What do you want to do?" Emma watched the segment end, the anchor moving smoothly to a weather report as though she hadn't just detonated a charge under someone's entire life on live television. Her phone had already started buzzing, coworkers, a number she didn't recognize that she suspected was a reporter, a text from Renata that simply read, "Call me right now." "I want to fight," Emma said, and for the first time in 4 years her voice didn't sound exhausted. It sounded like the voice of someone who used to give orders under fire and didn't appreciate being told to stand down. "But fighting back means the Hargrove report has to come out, Daniel. All of it. And once it's out, there's no controlling who it lands on, or how hard." "Then let it land," Daniel said. "You didn't create this mess. You just refused to lie about it. That's not something you should have to apologize for, and it's definitely not something worth burying yourself alive to protect." Emma's phone buzzed again, the same unknown number from 2 nights ago. She stared at it for a long beat before answering, putting it on speaker so Daniel could hear. "This is Lawson." "You should have stayed quiet, Sergeant." The same precise, measured voice as before, colder this time. "The story's already moving. By morning, nobody at that hospital will trust a word out of your mouth, and any version of the Hargrove incident you try to release will look like the bitter fabrication of a disgraced employee trying to save her job. We made sure of that." "You can't bury a man's death forever," Emma said, voice steady despite the tremors she felt building in her chest. "We buried it for 6 years, the voice said. We'll bury it for 60 more if we have to. You're not the threat here, Sergeant. You're a loose thread, and loose threads get cut. I'd suggest you remember that before you do anything you can't undo." The line went dead. Emma set the phone down on the table, hands shaking now in a way she didn't bother hiding, and looked across at Daniel, whose face had gone very still in the particular way of a man calculating exactly how much danger had just announced itself. "That wasn't a warning anymore," she said quietly. "That was a threat. Direct. On the record, more or less." "We need to record everything from here forward," Daniel said. "Every call, every message. If they're escalating, we document every single step." "Documentation doesn't stop people who've already buried one death," Emma said. "If they're willing to threaten me directly, that means they're worried. Worried means they think the truth could actually surface. And people who are worried about exposure don't usually stop at character assassination." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by Biscuit's soft snore from the floor. "You think they'd come after you physically?" Daniel said. It wasn't really a question. I think 6 years ago, a man died in a facility that wasn't supposed to exist, and the people responsible have had 6 years to get comfortable with the idea that nobody would ever ask questions again, Emma said. I think I just became the first person in 6 years to make them nervous enough to call me directly, instead of just flagging a file and hoping I'd stay quiet out of fear. She looked at him. And I think that means we don't have much time before nervous turns into something a great deal worse. Outside, headlights swept briefly across her living room window, slowing as they passed before continuing on down the street. Probably nothing. Probably just a neighbor coming home late, the kind of ordinary noise that would have meant nothing 3 days ago. Emma was already on her feet, moving toward the window, every old instinct she'd spent 4 years trying to bury, snapping back online at once. "Emma, get down," she said, voice suddenly flat and commanding in a way that made Daniel's 23 years of training respond before his conscious mind even caught up, dropping low without question. "Get away from the window, now!" The headlights outside had stopped 3 houses down, engine idling in the dark, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Emma Lawson felt with absolute bone-deep certainty that the people who'd buried Hargrove for 6 years had decided exactly how they intended to deal with a loose thread. Daniel stayed flat against the living room floor, every muscle coiled, watching Emma move along the wall toward the window with a controlled economy of motion that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with whatever she'd been before nursing. She edged the curtain back a half-inch with 2 fingers, just enough to see without being seen. The idling car sat under a broken street lamp 3 houses down, its engine a low, patient hum in the otherwise quiet night. No headlights now, just shape and shadow. "Talk to me," Daniel whispered. "Sedan. Dark color, can't tell what under this light. 1 occupant, maybe 2. Her voice had dropped into something clipped and procedural, stripped of all the exhaustion from an hour ago. "They've been there 90 seconds. That's too long to be lost and too short to be settling in for surveillance. They're deciding something." "Deciding what?" "Whether the dog and the light in your friend's truck outside changed their math." She glanced toward the driveway where Daniel's pickup sat with Ranger visible through the back window, ears already pricked toward the street, sensing the same wrongness Emma had clocked 30 seconds before either human in the room. "Get your phone. Call it in. Tell dispatch suspicious vehicle occupied, parked with engine running, no plates visible from this angle." "You think a patrol car is going to scare off whoever's running an operation that stayed buried for 6 years? I think a patrol car shows up, and now there's a time-stamped record that something happened on this street tonight," Emma said. "People who erase incidents for a living hate time-stamped records almost as much as they hate witnesses." Daniel made the call, keeping his voice low and even while reciting the address. The dispatcher's calm, bored cadence felt almost obscene against the tightness in Daniel's chest, like the rest of the world hadn't gotten the memo that something had shifted tonight. The car's engine revved once, briefly, then eased into a slow roll forward. "It's moving," Emma said. It didn't speed past. It crept, deliberate, past Daniel's truck, past the edge of Emma's yard, slow enough that whoever sat behind the wheel clearly wanted to be seen leaving, wanted the message registered without the risk of an actual confrontation. Then it picked up speed at the corner and disappeared into the dark. Emma let the curtain fall back into place and exhaled slowly, the breath shaking on its way out despite her best efforts to keep it level. "They wanted us to see them," she said. "That wasn't surveillance, that was theater." "Theater meant to do what?" "Remind us we're not in control of the timeline anymore." She turned from the window, and for the first time since this entire mess started, Daniel saw something other than careful composure in her face. A flash of pure, cold fury. "They think fear's going to make me stay quiet. They don't understand that fear's not the emotion I run on anymore." So, the patrol car arrived 11 minutes later, lights off, a young officer doing a slow circuit of the block before knocking on Emma's door. Daniel handled most of the conversation, falling easily back into the clipped, factual register of a man used to giving statements after incidents. Make, approximate color, direction of travel, no plate visible, no immediate threat made but a clear pattern of intimidation given recent events. The officer wrote it down without much urgency, the kind of report that would sit in a database doing nothing unless something worse happened to justify pulling it back out. "Ma'am, You said there's been threatening phone calls too? The officer asked, glancing at Emma. Two, both from blocked or spoofed numbers. Do you want to file a formal complaint? I can connect you with our detective unit. Emma hesitated, weighing the value of an official record against the risk of triggering more attention from people who'd already demonstrated they had reach into systems most municipal police departments couldn't touch. Not yet, she said finally. I want this on file in case something happens. I'm not ready to escalate further until I understand the full picture. The officer left a card and a faint air of unease, the kind law enforcement carried when they sensed they were touching the edge of something bigger than their jurisdiction without being told what. Once the door closed, Daniel turned to Emma. You're not actually going to sit on this. I didn't say I was sitting on it. I said I wasn't escalating until I understand the picture. She moved to the kitchen table, pulling out the faded photograph again, setting it beside a legal pad she'd started filling with notes over the last 2 days. Names, dates, fragments of memory she'd spent years trying to suppress, now forced back into focus by necessity. There's exactly one person who might still have access to records that could corroborate what happened during Hargrove, someone who was in that facility the same night I was. If he's still alive and still willing to talk, his testimony alongside mine would be a lot harder to dismiss as bitterness. Who is he? A combat medic named Russo, specialist back then. He pulled overnight shifts in the same wing. Emma's jaw tightened. Last I heard, he'd been discharged not long after I was. Different circumstances, officially. I always wondered if it was the same reason. You think you can find him? I think I have to try, because right now it's my word against a hospital's leaked memo and a voice on the phone nobody can trace. She looked up at him, something hard and decided settling into her features. And I'm done letting other people control which version of this story gets to exist. Finding Russo took 2 days of careful, deliberate work, made harder by the fact that Emma couldn't risk using any official channel that might flag her search the way Daniel's inquiry had flagged hers. She worked instead through the quiet, informal network that existed beneath every official structure, a veteran support group she'd avoided for years out of her own need for distance. A volunteer coordinator who remembered a Russo from group sessions 2 states over. A phone number passed along after careful, vague explanations about an old friend trying to reconnect. The man who answered sounded older than his years, his voice carrying the particular rasp of someone who'd smoked through difficulties he didn't talk about. Russo. Specialist Russo, this is Emma Lawson. We served together near the same facility. About 6 years back. I don't know if you remember me. A long pause stretched across the line, long enough that Emma wondered if he'd hung up. Lawson, he said finally, voice tight. The nurse who wrote the report. You remember? I remember everything about that night, ma'am. I've spent 6 years trying not to. Another pause. Why are you calling me now? Because the people who buried that report are coming after me again, and I think they're scared enough that the truth might actually matter this time. I need someone who was there, someone who saw what I saw. You're asking me to put my name on something that already cost me my career once. I'm asking you to help me make sure a man's death finally gets accounted for, Emma said. I'm not going to pretend that's not a risk. I won't lie to you about that. But I think we're the only 2 people left who can make this version of events impossible to bury a second time. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, weighted with 6 years of a man's own private reckoning. I have a daughter now, Russo said eventually. She doesn't know anything about that deployment. I never told her, never told my wife the details, just that I served, that some things happen, that I don't talk about it. I understand if you can't. I didn't say I can't. His voice hardened slightly, settling into something closer to resolve. I said I have a daughter, and I'd like her to grow up believing her father didn't stay quiet his whole life out of fear. He exhaled, a long, rough sound. Tell me what you need. Daniel spent those same 2 days working a different angle, reaching out to contacts he hadn't spoken to in years, careful to frame every conversation as casual curiosity rather than active investigation, aware that the wrong word to the wrong person could draw the same kind of unwanted attention Emma had already endured. It was Patricia who finally called him back with something concrete. her voice lower than usual, careful in a way that told him she'd thought hard about whether to make this call at all. Daniel, what I'm about to tell you, you didn't hear from me. Understood. The sealed file you asked about. I dug a little further than I should have, mostly out of stubbornness because the lockout itself seemed wrong to me. There's a secondary flag attached, tied to an oversight inquiry from years back. An inspector general's office opened a preliminary review into the same facility your friend was attached to, the same time frame. The review was closed without findings. Closed how? Administratively. No conclusion reached, case marked inactive due to, and I'm quoting the file note here, insufficient corroborating testimony. Patricia's voice carried a particular weight on that phrase, the weight of someone who'd spent a career watching institutions use careful language to avoid saying what they meant. Daniel, an inspector general review doesn't get opened over nothing. Somebody official already suspected something was wrong 6 years ago. They just didn't have enough people willing to go on record. And now there might be 2. If your friend and whoever she's trying to reach are both willing to testify, that changes the math significantly. An inactive case can be reopened if new corroborating testimony surfaces. That's not me speculating. That's how the regulation reads. Daniel thanked her, hung up, and sat for a long moment in his kitchen with Ranger's head resting against his knee, turning the new information over. A closed inquiry wasn't justice, but it was a door that had never fully shut, and doors that hadn't fully shut could be pushed back open by exactly the kind of pressure Emma was building. He called her immediately, relaying everything Patricia had told him. An IG review, Emma repeated slowly. That's bigger than I expected. That means someone with real authority already suspected wrongdoing and got shut down. Which means if you and Russo go on record now, you're not just 2 disgruntled veterans making accusations. You're new evidence for a case that was already open once. It also means whoever buried it the first time knows exactly how thin that justification was, Emma said. Insufficient corroborating testimony. That's not nothing happened. That's we made sure nobody was willing to talk. If they're worried about 2 witnesses now, imagine how worried they were the first time when they had to actively suppress more than that. What do you want to do with this? I want to take it somewhere they can't quietly bury it again, Emma said. Not local news, not another leak that gets spun before anyone checks the facts. I want it in front of someone with actual authority to reopen that inquiry, with Russo's statement and mine attached, before they have time to build their next narrative. You have someone in mind? I might, Emma said. There's a colonel I served under briefly before my transfer to the facility, strict, by the book in a way that made her unpopular with people who preferred bending rules. If anyone in the chain of command still cares about doing this properly, it's her. The question is whether she's still serving, and whether she'd even take my call after 6 years of silence. Colonel Patricia Adair, no relation to Daniel's contact. Patricia Vance, a coincidence Emma noted with a tired, humorless laugh, when she finally tracked down the name, had in fact risen 2 ranks since Emma's discharge, currently serving in an oversight capacity that put her uncomfortably close to the exact kind of institutional accountability the original cover-up had been designed to avoid. Reaching her required 3 days of careful navigation through official channels, a process that tested every ounce of patience Emma had left. When the call finally connected, Adair's voice carried the same crisp, no-nonsense authority Emma remembered from years ago, slightly older now, no less formidable. Lawson? I wondered if I'd ever hear from you again. Colonel, I apologize for the unconventional contact. I wasn't sure who else I could trust with this. Given what I understand happened to your file, I imagine your trust radius has gotten considerably smaller. A pause, weighted with old memory. I read your report, before it disappeared into whatever black hole swallowed it. I thought it was the most honest thing I'd seen cross my desk in years, and I said as much to people who very clearly didn't want to hear it. Emma felt something tight in her chest ease slightly, the unexpected relief of discovering she hadn't been entirely alone in believing the truth mattered, even if nobody had acted on that belief at the time. Colonel, I have new information, a corroborating witness willing to go on record, and I have reason to believe the people who buried this the first time are actively trying to discredit me again, right now, in real time, because they're worried it's resurfacing. Tell me everything, Adair said. And for the next 40 minutes, Emma did exactly that. The Hargrove incident in full, the original report, the discharge, the sealed file, the recent flag, the threats, the leaked memo, Russo's willingness to testify. Adair listened without interruption, the particular silence of someone taking careful, exact notes. When Emma finished, Adair exhaled slowly. This corroborates information I've heard whispers of for years, but never had the standing to chase down properly. I can reopen the Inspector General inquiry on the basis of new testimony. I'll need formal statements from you and Specialist Russo, properly documented, ideally with legal counsel present to protect you both from retaliation claims. What about the threats? The leaked memo to local news? Document everything exactly as it's happened. If someone's actively retaliating against you while a federal inquiry is reopening, that's not just relevant context, Lawson. That's potentially obstruction, and it gives us leverage we wouldn't otherwise have. Adair's voice hardened with the particular resolve of someone who'd spent a career navigating bureaucracy and had finally found a thread worth pulling all the way through. Whoever's behind this made a mistake escalating against you publicly. People who are confident in their cover-up stay quiet. People who are panicking make noise, and noise leaves trails. The formal statements took place 3 days later, in a small conference room at a regional military legal office 2 hours outside Millhaven, Russo flying in on short notice with a tightness around his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much since their phone call. Emma recognized something of herself in the careful, controlled way he held his hands, the way trauma sometimes settled into stillness rather than visible distress. They gave their statements separately, each unaware of precisely what the other had said until afterward. A deliberate procedural choice meant to demonstrate that their accounts hadn't been coordinated or rehearsed. When they finally compared notes outside the building, sitting on a low concrete wall in the gray afternoon light, the details lined up with the particular unsettling precision of two people who'd genuinely witnessed the same horror from different angles. "You really did write it all down back then," Russo said, almost wondering. "Word for word, like you knew someday someone would actually read it." "I didn't know," Emma said. "I just couldn't make myself write anything less than exactly what happened. Some habits you don't get to choose." Russo studied her for a long moment. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, I should have come forward with you back then. I was scared, and I let you carry it alone for 6 years. You're here now," Emma said. "That counts for more than you think." Daniel, waiting nearby with Ranger on a loose leash, watched the exchange with the particular satisfaction of someone seeing a wrong finally, slowly, begin correcting itself. Ranger sat calmly at his feet, attention drifting between Emma and the unfamiliar parking lot, occasionally lifting his head to track a passing car with the alert professional stillness of a working dog who'd never entirely stopped working. The legal office's senior counsel met with them before they left, outlining next steps with the careful, deliberate language lawyers used when they wanted to manage expectations without dampening hope entirely. "The reopened inquiry will take time," she said. "Weeks, possibly longer, depending on how cooperative the original facility's records custodians prove to be. In the meantime, I'd recommend formally notifying your hospital's legal department that you're a material witness in an active federal investigation tied to your previous service. That alone may be enough to halt their internal disciplinary process, since terminating you now could look like retaliation against a federal witness." "And the threats?" Daniel asked. "The phone calls? The surveillance outside her house?" "Document and report every incident, exactly as you have been. If we can establish a clear pattern of retaliation timed against the reopened inquiry, that becomes its own separate legal exposure for whoever's behind it. People who think they're protecting themselves by intimidating a witness sometimes end up building the strongest case against themselves." The hospital's legal department received Emma's notification the following morning, delivered through her own attorney with deliberate formality, and the effect was almost immediate. Whitfield called her personally that afternoon, his voice carrying a noticeably different register than their last conversation. Less procedural distance, more careful anxiety. "Ms. Lawson, I wanted to reach out personally regarding your status." "I'm listening." In light of the information your counsel provided, the hospital is suspending the disciplinary review pending the outcome of the federal inquiry. Your administrative leave will be reclassified as paid, retroactive to the date it began. A pause, weighted with the particular discomfort of a man realizing he had badly misjudged a situation. I want to be clear that the hospital never intended to retaliate against a federal witness. We were operating without full information. You leaked a story to local news before your own internal review even concluded, Emma said, voice flat. I'd like to understand how that happened, since you've claimed repeatedly that the hospital wasn't the source. We're conducting our own internal investigation into that leak, Whitfield said. I can tell you that preliminary findings suggest the information didn't originate from within hospital administration. We believe someone outside the organization had access to your personnel file and provided selectively edited information to the press. Someone with access to my sealed personnel file, Emma repeated slowly. That's a very small list of people, Mr. Whitfield. I'm aware, he said, and for the first time something like genuine unease colored his voice. I'll be honest with you, Ms. Lawson, because I think honesty is the least I owe you at this point. The inquiry we received from the Department of Defense originally came through unusual channels, not the standard verification process we normally use for background checks. It came through a contact one of our board members has, someone connected to a private consulting firm that handles, and I'm quoting their description here, institutional risk management for organizations with sensitive personnel concerns. Emma felt something cold settle into her stomach. A consulting firm pushed an inquiry into my sealed military file to your board, and your board acted on it without question? It's not uncommon for hospitals our size to use outside consultants for credentialing verification, Whitfield said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. I didn't think to question the source until now. I'd like the name of that consulting firm, Emma said. There was a long pause. I'll need to check with our board chair before releasing that information. Given everything you've described to your attorney about the nature of this federal inquiry, I think it's possible the hospital itself has been used as a vector for something considerably larger than a personnel dispute. After the call ended, Emma sat very still at her kitchen table, the photograph of herself and Ranger still propped against the same coffee mug from days ago, and felt the shape of the entire conspiracy shifting into clearer focus. Whoever had buried the Hargrove incident 6 years ago hadn't simply flagged a database when her name resurfaced. They'd actively reached into a civilian hospital's credentialing process, used a private firm as a deniable cutout, manufactured a pretext to destabilize her employment and credibility before she could even consider going public. That kind of reach, that kind of coordination, wasn't the work of a single nervous official trying to protect themselves. It suggested an entire apparatus, built and maintained for exactly this purpose, identifying threats to a buried truth and systematically dismantling them before anyone outside the system noticed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Adair. Need you to call me immediately. We found something in the reopened inquiry that changes the scope of this considerably. Not over text. Emma's hands had gone cold by the time she finished reading. She called immediately, and Adair answered on the first ring, her voice carrying none of its usual measured calm. Lawson, the original Inspector General review from 6 years ago. I pulled the full file, not just the summary closure notice. And? The officer who signed off on closing that inquiry as inactive, citing insufficient corroborating testimony. I cross-referenced his name against current Department of Defense contracts. Adair's voice tightened further. He retired 18 months after closing your case. He currently sits on the executive board of a private consulting firm that specializes in institutional risk management for hospitals, universities, and government contractors. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath Emma's feet. The same firm that flagged my hospital. The exact same firm, Adair confirmed. Lawson, the man who buried the original inquiry into Hargrove, didn't just close a case 6 years ago and walk away clean. He built an entire post-retirement career out of managing exactly this kind of exposure for people willing to pay for it. And right now, every piece of evidence suggests he's the one currently running the operation trying to discredit you before this inquiry can reach far enough to expose him. Emma stared at the faded photograph on her kitchen table, at the younger version of herself standing beside a wounded dog, nobody believed could be saved, and felt something settle into place beneath the fear, cold, clear, and absolutely certain. "Colonel," she said quietly, "I need everything you have on this man. His name, his firm, every contract he's touched since retirement. Because if he's the one who's been pulling strings from the shadows for 6 years, I think it's time somebody pulled him out into the light, where the rest of us can finally see exactly what he's been protecting, and exactly how far he's willing to go to keep protecting it." Adair sent the file within the hour, a dense packet of contracts, board minutes, and financial disclosures that read, on the surface, like the unremarkable paper trail of a man who'd built a quiet, lucrative second career out of institutional consulting. The name attached to all of it was Gerald Tanner, a retired colonel who'd spent the last 6 years operating a firm called Meridian Risk Partners, ostensibly specializing in credentialing audits and compliance reviews for hospitals, universities, and defense contractors too small to maintain that expertise in-house. Emma read through the documents at her kitchen table with Daniel sitting across from her, Ranger asleep on the floor between them, his breathing slow and even in a way Daniel still hadn't fully adjusted to seeing. "He's careful," Emma said, scrolling through a list of past clients. "Every contract's legitimate on its face. Nothing that screams cover-up. Just a man who happens to get hired by institutions right before something inconvenient about a former employee starts circulating. How many times has this happened before us? 3 that I can find so far. A university that quietly settled with a whistleblower professor, a defense contractor that fired an engineer who raised safety concerns about a parts supplier, a regional hospital chain that pushed out a compliance officer after she flagged billing irregularities." Emma's jaw tightened with each name. Meridian got hired by all 3 right before things went sideways for the person raising concerns. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern, and patterns leave evidence even when individual incidents don't. "So he's not just protecting Hargrove," Daniel said slowly. "He's running an entire business built on burying inconvenient truths for clients willing to pay for the privilege." "Hargrove's probably just the first one, the one that taught him how profitable silence could be." Emma closed the laptop, exhaling slowly. "Colonel Adair needs this. All of it. Because right now, what happened to me looks like an isolated personnel dispute that escalated badly. But if we can show a documented pattern across multiple institutions, this stops being my word against a vague consulting firm and becomes a federal case about a man systematically obstructing accountability for profit." The next 2 weeks moved with a strange, suspended urgency. The particular feeling of waiting for machinery too large to see set itself into motion. Colonel Adair's office formally expanded the reopened inquiry to include Meridian Risk Partners as a subject of investigation, a development that triggered its own cascading effects: a federal subpoena for Tanner's financial and client records, quiet outreach to the other institutions whose past personnel disputes now looked considerably less coincidental. Emma's hospital reinstated her fully, Whitfield personally calling to confirm her return to the schedule with an apology that sounded almost sincere, though Emma suspected the sincerity owed more to legal exposure than genuine remorse. Renata met her at the nurse's station on her first day back, pulling her into a brief, fierce hug before either of them could overthink the gesture. "Half this floor's been talking about you non-stop," Renata said. "Not the bad kind of talking, the kind where people realize they should have stood up for you weeks ago and feel like garbage about it now." "I don't need anyone feeling like garbage," Emma said. "I just needed my job back." "You're getting both, apparently." Renata handed her a tablet with the day's assignments, the same gesture she'd made 100 times before, except now it felt like something closer to a quiet ceremony of restoration. "Welcome back, Lawson." Russo's situation proved more complicated. His old discharge, like Emma's, had been buried under language designed to discourage questions, and reopening his case meant confronting the Army's own institutional reluctance to admit a 6-year-old mistake. But Adair pushed the matter personally, citing his corroborating testimony as critical to an active federal investigation, and within 10 days, Russo received formal notice that his discharge characterization was under review for upgrade, with back pay and benefits under consideration pending the outcome. He called Emma the night the notice arrived, his voice thick in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion this time. "I told my daughter," he said. Finally told her everything. She's 12, Lawson. Old enough to actually understand what it means that her father stayed quiet for 6 years because he was scared. A pause, rough with emotion. She didn't say much, just hugged me and told me she was proud of me for telling the truth now, even if it was late. It's not too late, Emma said. It's exactly on time. The world just took longer than it should have to be ready for it. Tanner's collapse, when it finally came, happened with the particular swiftness of structures that look solid right up until the moment the load-bearing wall gives way. A federal subpoena for Meridian's full client records turned up internal emails Tanner had apparently never expected anyone outside his small circle to read. Correspondence discussing managing reputational exposure for clients. Explicit references to using third-party credentialing inquiries as leverage against specific named individuals. And most damning, a message thread from 6 years earlier discussing how to ensure the Hargrove matter remains administratively closed, that named Tanner directly as the officer who'd signed the original closure. The story broke nationally within days, not through a leak this time, but through a formal Department of Defense press statement confirming an active investigation into a retired officer's private consulting firm for obstruction of justice and witness intimidation connected to a reopened inquiry into a service member's death years earlier. Emma's name appeared in the coverage, but this time framed entirely differently. Not as a discredited employee with falsified credentials, but as the whistleblower whose persistence had finally cracked open a years-long cover-up. Daniel watched the press conference from his kitchen, Ranger's head resting against his leg, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't expected, a kind of vindication that belonged as much to the dog as to the woman the dog had recognized in a crowded lobby weeks earlier. "You did this, buddy," he said quietly, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "You're the one who walked across that room and started all of it." Ranger huffed softly, tail thumping once against the floor, as though he understood exactly how much weight that moment had carried. Tanner was arrested 11 days after the press statement, federal agents taking him into custody outside his own consulting office, in a scene captured by exactly the kind of news cameras he'd spent 6 years learning to manipulate for other people's benefit. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't need to. The charges spoke clearly enough on their own: obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, conspiracy to falsify official records, with additional charges anticipated as investigators worked through the other institutions Meridian had quietly destabilized over the years. The university professor who'd been pushed out years earlier filed a civil suit within a week, citing the new federal investigation as corroborating evidence for claims she'd never been able to prove on her own. The engineer fired from the defense contractor reached out to a journalist covering the story, his own account finally finding an audience willing to take it seriously. One by one, the people Tanner had quietly buried over the years began surfacing, each new voice making the next one easier to believe. Emma watched it unfold with a complicated, exhausted satisfaction that didn't feel anything like the clean triumph she might have imagined years earlier, back when she'd still believed truth moved quickly once it finally started moving at all. It moved slowly, it moved messily, but it moved, and that she'd learned was sometimes the most anyone could ask of justice. The formal resolution of the Hargrove inquiry took another month, longer than anyone wanted, shorter than Emma had feared given how thoroughly the original case had been buried. The final report confirmed what she'd written 6 years earlier, almost word for word. The man under their care had died from injuries sustained during an unauthorized interrogation method that violated multiple standing protocols, a death subsequently misrepresented as equipment failure to avoid the institutional consequences of admitting otherwise. Colonel Adair called Emma personally to deliver the findings before they became public record, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who'd spent a career hoping the system she served would eventually prove worth the faith she'd kept in it. "Sergeant Lawson," she said, deliberately using the rank Emma hadn't heard attached to her own name in 6 years, "the report formally vindicates your original account in full. Your discharge characterization is being upgraded to honorable, with full benefits restored retroactively. And I want you to know, because I don't think anyone said this to you clearly enough 6 years ago, that what you did that night, refusing to sign a falsified report under significant pressure, was the kind of integrity this institution depends on far more than it usually deserves." Emma sat with the phone pressed to her ear, throat too tight to speak for a long moment. "Thank you, Colonel, for believing me when it would have been easier not to." "Don't thank me yet," Adair said. "There's a formal commendation ceremony being arranged, recognizing both you and Specialist Russo for the role your testimony played in reopening a case that should never have closed in the first place. I'd like you to attend if you're willing. Some recognitions matter more when they happen in front of the people who once doubted you." The ceremony took place 3 weeks later, in a modest auditorium at a regional military installation, considerably smaller than the grand official events Emma had occasionally watched from a distance during her active service, but no less significant for its size. Russo flew in with his wife and daughter, the 12-year-old sitting in the front row with an expression of fierce, unguarded pride that made something in Emma's chest ache with a feeling she hadn't let herself fully access in years. Daniel attended with Ranger, who sat at perfect attention beside him in the aisle, drawing curious glances from attendees who clearly wondered why a retired working dog had been included on the program. He didn't have to wonder long. When Colonel Adair called Emma forward to receive her commendation, Ranger broke from Daniel's side without command, padding up the aisle to sit beside her at the podium, exactly where he'd planted himself in that crowded lobby weeks earlier. A ripple of soft laughter and quiet emotion moved through the audience. Adair didn't try to stop it. "For those who don't know the full story," Adair said into the microphone, "this dog is the reason any of us are standing here today. 6 years ago, Sergeant Lawson refused to abandon an animal everyone else had written off as too damaged to save. Weeks ago, that same animal refused to let the world forget the woman who'd saved him, even after she'd spent years trying to disappear into an ordinary life rather than risk the truth surfacing again." She turned to Emma. "Sometimes loyalty remembers what bureaucracy tries to erase." Emma accepted the commendation with hands that were, for the first time in weeks, completely steady. She looked out at the small audience, Russo's daughter beaming, Daniel standing near the back with an expression he probably didn't realize was quite so transparent, Renata and a few coworkers who'd driven 2 hours to attend, Whitfield sitting stiffly near the rear in what Emma suspected was equal parts genuine respect and lingering institutional discomfort. "I'm not going to pretend this is a clean story," Emma said, setting aside the prepared remarks Adair's office had drafted for her. "I spent 6 years hiding from a truth I should have fought to defend the moment it happened. I told myself disappearing was safer, smarter, easier on everyone involved. It wasn't any of those things. It was just quieter, and quiet isn't the same as right." She glanced down at Ranger, who looked up at her with the same patient, unwavering attention he'd given her since the moment he found her in that crowded lobby. "This dog didn't know how to disappear. He didn't know how to pretend the people who hurt him didn't exist, or that the people who healed him didn't matter. He just remembered, plainly and completely, exactly what was true. I think there's a lesson in that most of us spend our whole lives trying to avoid learning." She paused, scanning the room one more time. "If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, told your account of events doesn't matter, because the people contradicting you have more rank, more money, more reach, I'm not going to tell you the system will always eventually fix itself. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the truth stays buried, and the people who buried it get to keep their pensions and their consulting fees and their quiet, comfortable retirements. But sometimes it doesn't stay buried, and the only way to find out which version you're living is to refuse to stop telling the truth, even when telling it costs you everything you thought you'd built." She looked at Russo, then at Daniel, then finally back at the audience. "I got lucky. I had a dog who refused to forget me, a stranger willing to ask an uncomfortable question, and a colonel who'd kept faith in a report everyone else had buried. Most people who tell the truth don't get that kind of luck. That doesn't mean the truth wasn't worth telling anyway." The applause that followed wasn't loud or theatrical. It was steady, sustained, the particular sound of a room full of people who understood exactly what it had cost her to stand there and say all of that out loud. Tanner's trial concluded 4 months later, ending in a conviction on obstruction and witness intimidation charges, with sentencing that included significant prison time and a permanent bar from any future government consulting work. The judge, reading the sentence, noted specifically that Tanner's actions had not merely concealed a single death, but had established a template for institutional cowardice that other powerful people had been willing to pay handsomely to replicate. 3 additional civil suits from his other victims settled in the months following, each settlement quietly affirming what the original institutions had spent years denying. Millhaven General used the publicity, somewhat to Emma's discomfort, to announce a new whistleblower protection policy named in recognition of her case, though she insisted the ceremony marking its implementation be small and brief. She didn't want to become a symbol. She wanted to go back to work, to the version of her life that had nothing to do with sealed files and consulting firms and men who'd built careers on other people's silence. Mostly, she got that wish. She returned to the floor full-time, eventually accepting the leadership position Renata had been quietly lobbying administration to offer her for over a year, a role overseeing trauma response training for new nurses that let her teach the careful, deliberate skills she'd spent years refining without ever having to explain exactly where she'd learned them. Daniel remained a fixture in her life in a way neither of them had explicitly planned, but both had quietly welcomed. His visits to her apartment with Ranger becoming frequent enough that Biscuit had stopped barking at the door the moment he heard the truck pull into the driveway. Ranger's limp, the old injury that specialists had insisted would never fully resolve, continued its strange, gradual improvement, the kind of recovery Dr. Green eventually stopped trying to explain in purely clinical terms. "I've treated working dogs for almost 30 years, he told Emma during one of Ranger's follow-up visits, watching the dog move across the exam room with a steadiness that hadn't been there months earlier. "I don't have a medical explanation for what's happened to this leg since you came back into his life. I'm not sure I need one. Maybe he just finally stopped carrying something he didn't need to carry anymore," Emma said, crouching down to scratch behind his ears. Ranger leaned into her hand, content, steady, exactly where he belonged. On a quiet evening months after the trial concluded, Emma sat on her back porch with Daniel, watching Biscuit and Ranger chase each other across the small yard in the fading light, the kind of unremarkable, peaceful scene she'd once believed she'd have to disappear entirely to ever feel safe enough to enjoy. "You ever think about what would have happened if Ranger hadn't recognized you that day?" Daniel asked. "If you'd just gone in for a routine appointment and walked back out without anyone ever knowing?" "I think about it sometimes," Emma admitted. "I think I would have kept disappearing a little more every year until there wasn't much left of who I actually was. I think Tanner would have kept getting hired by institutions that wanted convenient silence instead of inconvenient truth. And I think eventually somebody else would have paid the price I almost paid, except they might not have had a stubborn dog and an even more stubborn sergeant willing to ask uncomfortable questions on their behalf. For what it's worth," Daniel said, "I'm glad he didn't let either of us off easy that day." "Me too." Emma watched the dogs collapse together in a tangle of fur near the porch steps, both finally tired enough to rest. "I spent years thinking the safest version of myself was the smallest one, the quietest one. Turns out the truth doesn't actually need you to be loud. It just needs you to stop running long enough to let it catch up." The last light faded slowly over the yard, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Emma Lawson felt no urge at all to look over her shoulder, no instinct telling her to calculate exits or watch headlights linger too long on a quiet street. The fight that had cost her almost everything had finally, completely ended. Not with vengeance, not with cruelty toward the people who'd wronged her, but with something steadier and far more lasting. The truth, finally standing in the open where it had always belonged, and a woman who'd spent 6 years hiding from her own courage, finally letting herself be seen. Adair's file arrived within the hour, and Emma read it twice before she let herself believe what it said. Gerald Tanner, retired colonel, founder of a firm called Meridian Risk Partners, built on 6 years of quiet consulting contracts for hospitals, universities, and defense suppliers who needed inconvenient employees handled before they became inconvenient headlines. He signed the closure order on Hargrove himself, she said, sliding the laptop toward Daniel. 18 months later, he retires and starts a company that does exactly the thing he got away with doing to me. Daniel scanned the page, jaw tightening. This isn't his first time doing this. It's not even his third. Emma scrolled to a list of past clients. A university that settled with a whistleblower professor. A contractor that fired an engineer over safety concerns. A hospital chain that pushed out a compliance officer who'd flagged billing fraud. Meridian got hired right before each one of these people lost everything. That's not coincidence. That's a business model. So Hargrove wasn't an isolated mistake, Daniel said. It's the prototype. And right now, Colonel Adair has enough to make that argument to a federal investigator instead of just a personnel board. Emma closed the laptop, hands steady for the first time in days. This stops being my word against a vague inquiry. This becomes a pattern with a name attached to it. Well, the next 2 weeks moved fast once the right people finally believed there was something worth moving for. Adair expanded the inquiry to include Meridian as a subject, which triggered a federal subpoena for Tanner's financial and client records. Emma's hospital reinstated her with full pay restored, Whitfield delivering the news in a voice that had lost every trace of its earlier certainty. "I want to be honest with you," he said over the phone. "The original inquiry into your file didn't come through our normal verification channels. It came through a board member's contact at a private consulting firm. We didn't think to question the source." "You mean Meridian Risk Partners?" The silence on his end answered before he did. "I'll need to confirm that internally before I say more." "You already just did," Emma said, and hung up. Russo's discharge review moved faster than either of them expected, Adair personally citing his corroborating testimony as critical to an active federal case. He called Emma the night his upgrade notice arrived, his voice rough with something that wasn't exhaustion. "Told my daughter everything tonight," he said. "All of it. She just hugged me, said she was proud I finally told the truth, even 6 years late." "It's not late," Emma said. "It's exactly when you were ready. That counts." Tanner's collapse came fast once the subpoena hit. Internal emails surfaced discussing how to manage reputational exposure for clients. One thread from 6 years earlier laying out, in his own words, how to ensure the Hargrove matter stayed administratively closed. The Department of Defense issued a formal statement confirming an investigation into a retired officer's consulting firm for obstruction and witness intimidation. Emma's name appeared in the coverage again, but this time as the nurse whose persistence had cracked open a cover-up 6 years in the making. Daniel watched the press conference with Ranger's head against his knee. "You started all of it, buddy," he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Ranger thumped his tail once against the floor, as if he understood exactly what that moment had cost and what it had finally bought back. Tanner was arrested 11 days later, led out of his own office in front of cameras he'd spent years learning to manipulate for other people. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The charges said enough. Obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, conspiracy to falsify records, with more expected as investigators worked through Meridian's other clients. The professor filed suit within the week. The engineer found a journalist willing to listen. One buried voice after another came up for air, each one making the next easier to believe. Quiet. The formal findings on Hargrove came down a month later, confirming what Emma had written 6 years earlier, almost word for word. A death caused by an unauthorized interrogation method, falsely recorded as equipment failure to avoid institutional consequence. Adair called her personally before it went public. "Sergeant Lawson," she said, using the rank deliberately, "your discharge is being upgraded to honorable. Full benefits, retroactive. What you did that night, refusing to sign a false report under pressure, most people would have folded under. That's exactly the kind of integrity this institution depends on and rarely deserves." Emma sat with the phone against her ear, throat too tight to answer right away. "Thank you for believing me when it would have been easier not to." "There's a commendation ceremony being arranged," Adair said, "for you and Russo both. I'd like you there. Some things matter more when they happen in front of the people who once doubted you." The ceremony was small, held in a modest auditorium 2 hours outside Mill Haven. Russo flew in with his wife and daughter, the 12-year-old sitting in the front row with a fierce, unguarded pride that caught Emma somewhere in the chest she hadn't expected. Daniel came with Ranger, who sat at attention beside him until Adair called Emma forward. And then the dog broke formation without command, padding up the aisle to plant himself at her side exactly the way he had in that crowded vet clinic lobby weeks earlier. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Adair let it happen. For those who don't know the whole story, she said into the microphone, this dog is the reason any of us are standing here. Sergeant Lawson refused to give up on an animal everyone else had written off. Weeks ago, he refused to let the world forget the woman who saved him. She turned to Emma. Loyalty remembers what bureaucracy tries to erase. Emma accepted the commendation with steady hands and set aside the prepared remarks in her pocket. I'm not going to make this sound clean, she said. I spent 6 years hiding from a truth I should have fought for the moment it happened. I told myself disappearing was safer. It wasn't safer. It was just quieter, and quiet isn't the same thing as right. She looked down at Ranger, then back at the room. This dog never learned how to pretend the people who hurt him didn't exist, or that the people who healed him didn't matter. He just remembered completely what was true. Most of us spend our whole lives trying to avoid that kind of memory. She found Russo's eyes, then Daniel's near the back. If you've ever been dismissed because someone above you had more rank, or more money, or more reach than your version of the truth, I won't tell you the system always fixes itself. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the people who bury the truth keep their pensions and their quiet retirements. But sometimes it doesn't stay buried. And the only way to find out which one you're living is to keep telling it anyway, even when it costs you everything you thought you'd built. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was steady, the sound of a room that understood exactly what it had taken her to say all of that out loud. Tanner's trial ended 3 months later in conviction on every major charge. The judge noting in sentencing that his actions hadn't just buried one death, they'd built a template for institutional cowardice that other powerful people had paid well to copy. 3 more civil suits followed from his earlier victims, each settlement quietly confirming what those institutions had spent years denying. Millhaven General reinstated Emma fully and eventually offered her the leadership role Renata had been pushing administration toward for over a year, overseeing trauma response training for incoming nurses, letting her teach the careful, exact skills she'd built years ago without ever needing to explain where she'd learned them. Daniel stayed close in the months after, his visits with Ranger becoming frequent enough that Biscuit stopped barking the second he heard the truck in the driveway. Ranger's old limp, the one specialists swore would never fully resolve, kept easing month by month until Dr. Green finally stopped trying to explain it in clinical terms at all. 30 years treating working dogs, he told her at a follow-up visit, watching Ranger cross the exam room without favoring the leg once. I don't have a medical answer for this. I'm not sure I need one. Maybe he just stopped carrying something he didn't have to carry anymore, Emma said, crouching to scratch behind his ears. On a quiet evening that fall, Emma sat on her back porch with Daniel, watching Biscuit and Ranger chase each other across the yard in the last of the light. Ever think about what happens if he hadn't recognized you that morning? Daniel asked. If you just walked in and out and nobody ever knew? I think I would have kept disappearing a little more every year until there wasn't much left of who I actually was. Emma watched the dogs collapse together near the steps, finally worn out. And Tanner would have kept getting hired by people who wanted convenient silence over inconvenient truth until somebody else paid the price I almost paid. Somebody without a stubborn dog and an even more stubborn sergeant willing to ask the wrong questions. Glad he didn't let either of us off easy, Daniel said. Me too. She let the silence sit for a moment, comfortable instead of heavy. I spent 6 years thinking the safest version of me was the smallest one. Turns out the truth doesn't need you loud. It just needs you to stop running long enough to let it catch up. The light faded slow over the yard, and for the first time since this whole thing started, Emma didn't check the street, didn't count exits, didn't wait for headlights to linger too long outside her window. The fight that had cost her almost everything was finally over. Not with revenge, not with cruelty toward the people who'd wronged her, but with something that lasted longer than either of those things. The truth, standing out in the open where it always should have been, and a woman who'd spent 6 years hiding from her own courage finally letting herself be seen.